Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we are going to be sewing. We are going to be sewing along to Mccalls 7330, and I am going to be following along with view E on this pattern. You can feel free to make any other view that you want, but I'm going to be making view E. If you missed the preview video for this pattern, you can check it out here. In that video, I went over the size that I cut, the adjustments that I made to the pattern, as well as the notions and sewing tools that I'm going to be using to create the jacket. So if you have any of those questions, you can check that video out and get all the answers there. So now we can go ahead and cut out our pattern, cut out your fabric, transfer all of your markings, and let's get started. Step one is to go ahead and apply interfacing to all of your pattern pieces that need to be interfaced. So moving on to step two, we're going to be working with pattern piece number one, which is our front band, and pattern piece number two, which is the front bodice. You should have cut out 4 and 2 of interfacing. I'm going to put the 2 that are not interfaced to the side, and we're going to begin working on the ones that are interfaced. Before we start working on them, you want to do a row of stay stitching along the notched edge of your front band. And the stay stitching for this pattern is done at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. The pattern did not indicate where to stop with your stay stitching, so I just stopped about 8 inches from the bottom up to where I stopped. So I just have an 8-inch gap. You can bring it down lower or smaller if you want. Just make sure that you do some stay stitching along this notched edge of your front band. Once you have it stay stitched, we can go ahead and pin it to our front, right sides facing. If your fabric looks like mine and you need to indicate the front and the back, I just put an X right here so I will know. Or if you have some little stickies, you can use those as well. So with right sides facing, you should have transferred a notch. You're going to match that up. And pin in place. After you have one band pinned, you can pin the other one on. We can stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then you're going to press your seam allowance going toward the band. So let's go ahead and do our stitching now. All right, now that we have the front band sewn on, we can go ahead and trim our seam. Now that it's trimmed, let's go ahead and give it a press and make sure that you have your seam going toward your band. Now that you have your front band sewn on and you have it pressed, again, your seam allowance is going toward your band. We can put this to the side for just a moment and grab our uninterfaced front band pieces. So now we are going to fold in the seam allowance on the notched edge, which is 5/8 of an inch. We're going to fold that into the inside and give that a good press. If you need to clip around this curve, you can do that, but don't clip past your stay stitching, and go ahead and give this a press. Again, press up 5/8 of an inch. Now that we have pressed in our seam allowance, which is 5/8 of an inch, toward the inside of our uninterfaced front band pieces, now we can trim it down to 3/8 of an inch. Now that we have trimmed it down, let's move on to the next step. Next, we're going to grab our front pieces again. And now we're going to pan our front band facing to our band that we already have attached, the interfaced one. So with right sides facing, match up your bands and pin in place. Now that we have it pinned, let's go ahead and pin our other front facing on the same way, and then we can stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that we have the facing stitched on, go ahead and trim down your seam allowance. Now that we have it trimmed, let's go back to the sewing machine and let's do some understitching. With understitching, you want to make sure that you have your seam allowance facing toward your facing, and then we're going to stitch right close to this seam, stitching onto the facing, not onto the interface front band, but the facing one. So let's go ahead and do understitching now. Now that we've done our understitching, now we can go ahead and turn it to the inside, and then we're going to give it a good press. Once you have your facing pressed toward the inside, now we can go ahead and get a needle and thread and slip stitch this closed. Now for me, it takes me a while to do slip stitching, and for video purposes, I'm just gonna do a stitch in the ditch. So I am gonna put my pins along the outside here, right in this seam, making sure that I catch the pressed edge of the facing on the inside, and I'm gonna pin that down, and I'm just gonna continue doing that. Now, if I was not recording this, I would go ahead and grab my needle and thread. I'll put something on TV and just sit and go ahead and slip stitch it down. But again, for video purposes, I'm just gonna do a stitch and ditch. So again, I'm just pinning, making sure that I catch the pressed edge of the facing on the inside. So I'm gonna continue pinning and go ahead and stitch it in place. All right, I have gone ahead and I've done the stitch in the ditch along my front facing. So this is what the inside of mine looks like here. So after you have stitched down your facing band, whether you did it by slip stitch or by stitching in the ditch, and you have basted the raw edges along the top and the bottom of the front bands together, now we can move on to the next step. Next, we're going to begin working on our back pattern piece. So here's my back here. And we're going to create our pleat on the outside. So this is the wrong side. I'm going to turn it to the right side of my fabric, and you should have transferred some circles. I put notches up at the top as well. And so what we're going to do first is crease along our small dot. So you should have small dots and large dots. Crease along the small dot, and then you want to bring it over to the large dot. So I just like to fold it over onto it so that it's like this, so that you have the small dot matched up to the large circle. And so you're just creating a pleat. And again, you want the pleat to be on the outside of the fabric, and I'm going to put a pin to hold that in place. So again, this is my small dot here, and this is the large dot. I'm just bringing that dot over to the large dot to create a pleat. And I'm going to pin that in place. Now we're just going to go ahead and baste across the upper edge, and you can also baste along the lines of your pleat. So let's go ahead and baste it in place now. Now that we have basted our pleat in place, now we can go ahead and grab one of our yoke pattern pieces, and with right sides facing, we're going to match the centers and pin it in place. Once you have it pinned in place, we can go to the sewing machine and we can baste it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, now that we have it basted, we're going to go ahead and grab our other yoke piece. Now the pattern has you to go ahead and turn in your shoulder seam allowance at a 5/8 of an inch, press it, and then trim it down. We're going to omit that, and I'm going to show you why in just a moment. So this is my yoke. This is going to be the yoke facing, and I'm going to put it right sides to the wrong side. So this is the wrong side of the garment here. So I'm putting the right side of the yoke down to the wrong side. So let's go ahead and we're going to pin this together right along this seam. So grab your pins and let's pin this in place. All right, now we can go to the machine and we're going to stitch this at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance so you can follow right along your basting stitch. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now that we have it sewn, we can go ahead and trim our seam. All right, so now your back pattern piece should look like this. So now we can go ahead and give everything a good press. Now that we have given it a good press, let's go ahead and grab our front pattern pieces. All right, so here are my front pattern pieces here, and we're going to be pinning these to the shoulder seam and stitching in place, but make sure that you are only working on your yoke and not your yoke facing. So I'm going to put my yoke facing down here. And this is the yoke, the one that we attached it right sides facing to the back, the one that we based it on first. So now that we have just the yoke up here, let's go ahead and place these right sides facing. And now we can pin our shoulder seams in place. Match up your notches. All right, now let's go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, so we just stitched our shoulder seams together on a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and we did not stitch the yoke facing. That should still be unsewn. So I'm just gonna drop that down. I like to have that facing down there. And so now I'm just gonna roll my bodice up to create a burrito. So I'm just gonna fold it in like so. I'm just gonna start rolling. I'm gonna stop about here. All right, so here is the yoke facing here. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bring the shoulder seams from the yoke facing up so that they match up to the shoulder seams here that we've just stitched together. Then I'm gonna match up my notches and pin in place. All right, now that we have it pinned, we can go to the machine. We can follow along with our previous stitching and make sure that you have your bodice down. You do not want to accidentally catch it in your stitch. So let's go ahead to the machine now and stitch the yoke facing in place. All right, now that we have it sewn, we can trim our seam. All right, now we can go ahead and pull everything out right sides facing. All right, so this is what my bodice looks like, and you can see on the inside, instead of slip stitching over the shoulder seams, we've now stitched it in place and we have a really nice clean seam. So now we can just go ahead and give that a really good press. All right, now that we have it pressed, let's go ahead and do a little basting. We're going to baste our yokes together right here along the armhole, and then we're going to baste along the neck edge. So let's go ahead and do our basting now. All right, now that we have basted along the neck edge and right here along the armhole, now we can go ahead and put our bodice right sides facing and stitch our side seams together. So match up your notches, grab your pins and pin in place. Now that you have your side seams pinned, let's go ahead and stitch them in place. All right, now that we have our side seams sewn, you want to go ahead and finish off your seams with your serger, or however you're going to be finishing off your seams for this project, pinking shear, zigzag stitch, whatever works best for you. Go ahead and finish off your seams. And the next step, we're going to do some gathering. So on the lower edge of our bodice, we're going to gather between the bands. So we're going to start right beside the bands and go ahead and do 2 rows of gathering stitches all the way right before we get to the other one. We'll stop. So let's go ahead and do our gathering stitches now. All right, now that you have your gathering stitches in, I've done mine here, and now we can move on to the next step, which is to stay stitch along our neck edge. We're going to stay stitch the bands as well, and all the way along the neck edge, and stay stitching is 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now that we have done our stay stitching along the neck edge, now we can put the bodice to the side and start to work on the collar band. Alright, so here's my collar band here, and you should have cut out 2 of fabric and 1 of interfacing. So we're going to start working on the one that is not interfaced. We're going to put this to the side. So first we're going to start working on the side that has the single notches. So go ahead and find that side. It's this side here. We're going to press under 5/8 of an inch. And then once we have that pressed under, we're going to trim it down to 3/8 of an inch. So let's go ahead and press in the seam allowance on the uninterfaced collar band now. Now that you have it pressed, we can go ahead and trim our seam down to 3/8 of an inch. All right, now that we have it trimmed, now we can go ahead and grab our interface collar band and we can place them right sides facing. And we're going to be pinning along the edges here and this inner circle along the double notches. So grab your pins and let's pin in place. We're going to be keeping this outer edge open. All right, now that it's pinned, let's go ahead and stitch it in place. And we're going to be stitching right up here from this circle that we transferred, stitching here all the way around the double notched edge and all the way back to this circle here that we transferred, being sure to leave the single notched edge open. So let's go ahead and stitch it in place now. Now that we have the collar band sewn, let's go ahead and trim our seam and then turn it to the right side and give it a good press. All right, once you have your collar band pressed, now we can go ahead and pin it onto the bodice. So you just want to match up your notches and your markings and pin it in place. So right sides facing, we're going to pin and we're going to make sure that we keep the pressed edge of the collar band out of the way. We're just going to be pinning the interface side to it. So let's go ahead and start pinning in place now. Now, if you need to create a little bit more room right here, you can put some snips into your fabric, but don't go past your stay stitching. So you can grab your scissors and just put tiny snips. Use scissors, not snippers, but just put tiny clips into your fabric. But again, do not go past your stay stitching, and just continue pinning your collar band in place. Once you have the collar band pinned on, we can go to the machine and we can stitch it in place. After you have it stitched, you can go ahead and trim your seam and then press it going up to the collar band. So let's go ahead and stitch it in place now. All right, now that we have our collar band sewn on and we have trimmed our seam and then pressed it going up to the collar band, and we've pressed the facing over, now you want to go ahead and slip stitch this in place. I do recommend slip stitching your collar band in place. It'll give you a lot more control and it just look really nice and neat on the inside. All right, so I have my collar band finished, and as you can see, I did not do a stitch in the ditch. I went ahead and slip stitch it closed. I just felt like around that curve, I would have a lot more control of my fabric just doing it by hand. So now we can go ahead to the next step. Next, we're going to start working on our sleeves. So the first thing that you need to do is go ahead and put 2 rows of E-stitching along the sleeve cap. So I've gone ahead and done mine. And I also put some X's here just so I would know the right from the wrong side. Again, you could mark on your fabric or you could use some little stickies. That would be great as well. So once you have your E-stitching in along your sleeve cap, now we can go ahead and put our sleeves right sides facing. And we're going to pin along our sleeve seam. So go ahead and grab your pins and let's pin in place now. Once you have it pinned, we can go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and then go ahead and finish off your raw edges. Now that we have our sleeve seam sewn, we can go ahead and press up our hem and stitch it in place. Our hem allowance is 1 1/4 inches, so we're just going to press up the full 1 1/4 inches. And once you have it pressed, you're going to press in 1/4 inch on the raw edge, give it a good press, and then we can take it to the sewing machine and we're going to stitch close to the inner pressed fold. So again, go ahead and fold up 1 1/4 inches. You're going to press under 1/4 inch of that raw edge. And then we're going to go to the machine and stitch close to the fold. If you want, you can baste it in place first, and then on the right side, you can top stitch it. So let's go ahead and stitch our hem in place now. Once you have your hem of your sleeve sewn in place, now we can go ahead and install it into our bodice. So grab your front and back. And now we're just going to pin the sleeves right sides facing. Be sure that you find your notches so that they match up. So the single notch on your sleeve matches up to the single notch on your bodice, which goes to the front, and the double notch goes to the back. First, I'm going to match up my side seams and my sleeve seam and pin there in place. All right, and now we can go ahead and pin our sleeve in. Okay, so now you can go ahead and match up your notches, adjust your gathers, and pin your sleeve in place. Once you have one sleeve pinned in place, you can go ahead and pin your other one in, and then we can stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then you can finish off your raw edge. So let's go ahead and stitch our sleeves in place now. All right, once you have your sleeves installed, you can go ahead and cut off any loose threads that you have, and then we can put this to the side and start working on our waistband. To begin sewing our waistbands, first we're going to start with the waistbands that we've interfaced. So this is my back piece here, and these are the two fronts. So we're going to take them and put them right sides facing. You should have transferred some notches. We're going to match those and pin in place. All right, once you have them pinned, let's go ahead and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have it pinned, let's go ahead and press our seams open. All right, once we have our seams pressed open, we can go ahead and grab our bodice and pin it in place. All right, now that we have our bodice, let's go ahead and adjust our gathers. Then we're going to match up our notches, and you should have transferred 2 large circles. I missed those that line up to the center front, so I'm going to trace those markings back. Those large circles, they match up to the opening edges beside our front band. So let's go ahead. I'm going to transfer the markings, adjust the gathers, and pin our waistband to the bodice now. All right, now that we have the interfaced waistband pinned on, we have adjusted our gathers, we have everything pinned and ready to go, we can go to the machine and baste this in place. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now that we have the waistband basted on, let's go ahead and grab the waistband facing pieces, and we're going to stitch them along the side seams the same way that we did for these pieces. So let's go ahead and pin at the side seam and stitch these in place now. All right, once you have your waistband facing sewn together along the side seams, go ahead and press those seams open. And now we can go ahead and turn up the seam allowance on the lower edge of the band. And if it's a little confusing to you, take a look at your notches. You should have transferred a notch that's a little bit closer to the edge of the waistband, and this one's a little further in. That's the one that we're going to be folding up the seam allowance on. So that's the lower edge of the band. So you want to go ahead and fold up 5/8 of an inch, give that a press, and then trim it down to 3/8 of an inch. So let's go ahead and do that now. Once you have pressed up your 5/8 of an inch of your seam allowance, now we can go ahead and trim it down to 3/8 of an inch. All right, once you have it trimmed, we're going to go ahead and pin this to the wrong side of the bodice. So we're going to pin it just like we pin the yoke facing on. So let's go ahead and grab our bodice now. And we're going to be pinning the right side of the facing to the wrong side of the bodice. So go ahead and match up your side seams and begin to pin in place. I'm going to turn mine around this way. I'm going to match up my notches, my side seams, and pin everything in place. And again, it's the right side of your facing to the wrong side of your garment. All right, now that we have the waistband facing pinned on, we can go to the sewing machine and stitch it in place. We're going to stitch the ends as well as the lower edge at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead to the machine and stitch this in place now. All right, now that we have the facing of the waistband sewn on, we can go ahead and trim our seam down. All right, now we can go ahead and turn our facing down, poke out your corners, and give it all a good press. All right, once you have pressed down your waistband facing, now we can go ahead and put the bodice to the side and start to work on our pants. All right, to begin working on the pants of our jumpsuit, the first thing that we're going to do is start working with the zipper. So here's my zipper here, and I purchased a 9-inch zipper. I knew that it was going to be too long and that I would need to shorten it. So I went ahead and I measured, because you should have transferred some markings here. This right here is the left side, so I just transferred the fold line for the left. And then on the other side, I transferred the fold line for the right. You can also see that I applied a little bit of interfacing here just because I'll be installing a zipper. So that's why I have the interfacing there, just for a little bit of stability. But right here at the square that we transferred, that is where the zipper stop needs to go. Now our zipper is measured from the top of the zipper here down to the stop of the zipper, not from the ends to ends. It's measured from the stop to the stop. And so we need the zipper stop to be right here at the square. So I measured down from that. I also marked out my seam allowance, which would be 5/8 of an inch when we attach it to the bodice. So I marked that out as well. And right here at this line is where the square is. So this is where the zipper stop needs to be. And I've also marked an inch below that because I'm going to make this the new zipper stop, but then I'm going to just cut the excess off about an inch below. And so an easy way to create a new zipper stop is to get a needle and thread. And you could just go over the zipper tape a couple times just to create a new stop. Or you can also just go to your machine and do a zigzag stitch just a couple times to create a new stop, whatever works best for you. So right now I'm just gonna come up right beside the zipper teeth. I'm just gonna go right across. Just gonna do this a couple times just to create a new stop for the zipper. All right, now that I have created a new zipper stop, we can just give it a test. So we have a new zipper stop created, and right here at this line where I transferred, I'm just gonna use my pinking shears and I'm going to cut there. And now I have a new zipper. All right, so once you have shortened your zipper, let's go ahead and install it. You can see I finish off the raw edges of my front and back along the center seams, the inner leg seams, as well as the side seams. So you can go ahead and finish off yours if you'd like. And we're gonna start working on our front pieces, so let's put the backs to the side. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to stitch our front centers together between our notch and our large circle that we transferred. And then after the large circle, we're just going to do a basting stitch up to the top. So let's go ahead and grab our pins. We're going to find our notch and pin there and pin up to the large circle. Once you get to the large circle, you're going to do a basting stitch. So again, we're going to do a regular machine stitch between the notch and the large circle, and then from the large circle to the top of the pants, we're going to do a basting stitch. So let's go ahead and do that now. right, now that we have stitched right here between the notch and the large circle with our regular machine stitch, and we've done the basting, now we can go ahead and open our pants up to the inside. And for the left side of our pants, you should have transferred the fold line for the left. So let's go ahead and fold it along that fold line that we transferred and press that in place. All right, now that we have pressed the left extension along the fold line, now I'm going to flip my pants over. I'm going to move my right extension back so we can see the pressed edge of the left that we just pressed in place. I'm going to grab my zipper, and facing up, I'm going to line my zipper up right next to the fold, making sure that the zipper stop is matching up with the square. And I'm just going to double check. So there is my square marking there, and it's matching up to my zipper stop. So let's go ahead and line that up and pin in place. All right, once you have it pinned, we can go to the machine and we're going to stitch close to the fold right beside the zipper teeth. So go ahead and put on your zipper foot and let's go ahead and stitch this in place. Again, I'm stitching only to the left extension that we pressed back along the extension fold line. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, so I've just stitched right here along my zipper teeth. You can see my stitching here. So the next step, we're just going to open out our pants, and we're just going to let our zipper fall wherever it falls. So I'm just letting it lay. I'm not pulling it over anything. So just let your zipper fall. Go ahead and grab your pins, and we're going to pin it to the right fly extension. All right, once we have it pinned, let's go ahead and stitch it in place. And again, we're only stitching it to the fly extension, not to the front of the pant. All right, once you have the zipper sewn to the right side of the fly extension, now we can go ahead and baste this in place. So I'm just going to pin the right side to the front. And I'm just going to baste it in place. So I'm just going to baste right here along this side of the right fly extension, and I'm doing it through all layers. So this time we are working with the front of the pant. So I'm just going to baste right down here. All right, once we have it basted, we can go ahead and flip it onto the right side. And if you do not have your stitching line transferred, you can go ahead and grab your front pattern piece. You want to line up your center front seam. Then you can go ahead and transfer your stitching line for the right side. So go ahead and transfer this dotted line here, and then you can stitch along it. All right, once you have stitched along your stitching line, you can go ahead and remove your basting stitch. And now grab your seam ripper. We can take out our basting stitch here as well. And now we have a working front fly. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the next step. Next, we're going to go ahead and grab our back pattern pieces. And with right sides facing, we're going to pin our inner leg seams together. So let's go ahead and grab our pins and match up our notches and pin in place. All right, go ahead and pin your other inner leg seam the same way, and then we can stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have your inner leg seams sewn together, you can go ahead and press them open. Now that we have our inner leg seam pressed open, we can go ahead and pin the remainder of our crotch seam together and stitch that in place. So first I'm going to line up the inner leg seams and pin in place there, and continue pinning, matching up my notches. All right, once you have it pinned, we can go to the sewing machine. We're going to stitch the remainder crotch seam in place, and then we're going to stitch again a 1/4 of an inch away from that stitch between the notches, and then we can trim close to that second stitching. So let's go ahead and do those stitches now. All right, now that you have finished off the remainder of your crotch seam, and then you've done your second stitching a 1/4 of an inch away from that between the two notches, now you can go ahead and trim close to your second stitching. If any of you are wondering if I go back and do my trimming since I've already finished off my raw edge, that answer is rarely. And that's just because me personally, I don't notice that much of a difference as far as bulk in here. Now you may want to go ahead and trim. So by all means, go ahead and do that. But for me, since I already have my edges finished and everything is nice and clean, I just go ahead and leave that. But again, personal preference, you go ahead and trim yours if you need to. So now let's go ahead and move on to the next step. Next, we're going to go ahead and put our pants right sides facing, and we're going to pin our side seams together and stitch those in place. So go ahead and grab your pins. Let's match up our side seams, match up our notches, and pin everything in place. All right, go ahead and pin your other side seam in place. Then we can go to the sewing machine and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, once you have sewn your side seams and you have finished off your edges, you want to go ahead and give it a press. And then go ahead and do 2 rows of gathering stitches between the 2 notches on your pants along the upper edge. And then we can go ahead and start pinning it to our bodice. So let's grab our bodice now. All right, so with right sides facing, we are going to be pinning it to the pants, making sure that we keep the facing portion of our waistband free. All right, let's go ahead and match up our notches and start pinning in place. All right, once you have your bodice pinned to your pants, right sides facing, and you still should have this extension right here in the front. So let's go ahead to the machine and we can stitch it in place at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, once we have stitched the waistband onto the pants, we can go ahead and trim our seam and then press our seam going up into the waistband. All right, once you have it trimmed, you can press your seam going up into the waistband, and then you can bring the pressed edge of the waistband facing over that seam and pin it in place. All right, once you have your front band pinned, you want to go ahead and get your needle and thread and then go ahead and slip stitch your waistband in place. All right, once you have slip stitched your waistband facing closed, you can go ahead and give it a good press. After that, we're down to our finishings. So next you want to go ahead and try on your jumpsuit and then do your hem. We're going to be hemming our jumpsuit the same way that we did for our sleeves. So the hem allowance is 1 1/4 inches. So the same way that we hemmed, we pressed up our hem, folded in the raw edge. We're going to do the same thing for the hem of our pants. After you have your hem done, then you can go ahead and sew on your buttonholes to the right front band. If you need help with that for your machine, then please refer to your machine manual on how to sew on buttonholes. Then you can sew on your buttons to your left front band, and then you can attach your hook and eye closure, and then you are all done with your jumpsuit. Well, that is all for this sew along, and thank you all so much for watching. If you make this, please tag me. I would love to see your make. You can tag me on social at BrittanyJJones.com. If you have any questions, you can let me know below down in the comment section. And be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video. Blessings, everyone. Bye.